It was another frigid winter morning in Cleveland, the kind that sank deep into your bones. Leonard, 42, slumped against a brick wall on Broad Street, staring blankly at the cracked pavement. His battered cardboard sign read, "Anything helps. God bless." But the world rushed past, eyes averted, as if he didn't exist. Leonard hadn't always been here. Not in this spot. Not with the frigid air biting at his skin and his stomach growling louder than his pride could handle. Just a year ago, he had a job at a factory upstate. He'd been steady, reliable, the kind of guy who always clocked in on time, who made sure the work got done even when no one was watching. But when the factory shut down, so did his life. No warning, no notice, just an email one day telling him to go home. Like his years of hard work didn't matter. And so here he was now. The streets didn't care about your past or your story. They just wanted to know if you had enough to survive the next day. He hadn't been lucky enough for a shelter that night, and he'd spent hours trying to get comfortable in the cold, his legs cramping up from sitting too long. His clothes, ragged and worn, weren't enough to keep the chill out. He pulled them tighter around him, but it did little to stave off the ache in his chest, the one that wasn't from the cold. The ache that came from knowing that each day he was out here felt like another part of him slipping away. Every so often, someone would glance his way, maybe at the sign, but they'd keep walking. Heads turned to avoid his eyes. He knew it wasn't lack of care, just easier to ignore him. Still, he clung to the hope that someone might stop and ask, "Are you okay?" Leonard's tired eyes fell on a pair of pristine white sneakers, the kind that looked untouched by dirt or hardship. They stood out starkly against the gritty sidewalk, their perfection almost mocking him. He stared at them, unable to look away, feeling an odd twist in his gut. Slowly, his gaze climbed upward. The boy wearing them was tall, poised, and dressed in a sleek jacket that practically screamed luxury. Leonard's stomach churned as he took it in. This kid's world couldn't have been further from his own. Around them, people rushed by, heads down, lost in their own lives. But the boy stood still, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the noise and movement around him. To everyone else, he was just another rich kid, a picture of effortless privilege. To Leonard, he was a reminder of how far he'd fallen, of how different their lives were. Leonard sat there, invisible to the passing crowd, but his thoughts raced. What was it like to live without the constant fight, without the weight of survival pressing down on you? The boy's calm, unhurried presence seemed almost foreign, like a language Leonard couldn't understand. Then, for just a moment, the boy glanced up. Their eyes met, brief but electric. It wasn't a lingering gaze, not even a deliberate one. It was quick, automatic. Yet, for Leonard, it felt like something shifted. In that fleeting second, he wasn't invisible. He was seen. And somehow, that was enough to stir something deep within him. "Hey, young man," Leonard called, his voice shaky but steady enough to carry over the street noise. The words tumbled out before he could think, and he tried to smile, though it felt awkward, like wearing a mask that didn't fit. His breath came out in a visible puff of cold air. "Can you spare $1?" The boy froze, his fingers hovering over his phone screen. Leonard's heart thudded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. The seconds felt like minutes as he waited, caught between hope and regret for speaking up. People usually walked by without a glance, brushing him off with a quick shake of the head or a muttered, "Sorry." He was used to being invisible, but this kid, he wasn't walking away. The boy slowly looked up, his head tilting just slightly as if weighing the request. His expression was unreadable, but there was no impatience in his posture, no rush to dismiss Leonard like so many others. Instead, his gaze lingered, studying Leonard in a way that made him feel exposed and uncertain. It wasn't pity Leonard saw in those eyes. It was something deeper, something harder to pin down. Leonard's stomach churned. He felt the familiar knot of shame tightening in his chest, the same one that came every time he had to ask for help. But there was something about this boy's steady attention that made him hold his ground, even though he wanted to look away. It had been years since anyone had really seen him, truly seen him. Most people didn't even slow down long enough to notice the man slumped on the sidewalk, much less engage with him. Yet here was this kid, standing still on a busy street corner, looking at Leonard like he wasn't just another face in the crowd. And when the boy finally spoke, Leonard felt his breath catch. "What do you need it for?" The boy's question stopped Leonard cold. It wasn't pitying or dismissive, like the questions he was used to. This was calm, genuine, almost too calm for someone so young. It wasn't about the money. It was about something deeper. Leonard hesitated, the chill of the winter air wrapping tighter around him. No one had ever asked him that before, not in a way that made him feel like he mattered. Most people gave change to ease their guilt or avoided him altogether. But this boy was different. Well, Leonard started, rubbing his hands together. He wasn't used to explaining himself. A cup of coffee would be nice, maybe a sandwich, if I'm lucky. The last part came out like a joke, an attempt to lighten the weight of the truth. The boy, Barron, didn't laugh. He didn't rush off or glance at his phone. Instead, he slipped the device into his jacket pocket, his full attention on Leonard. That small gesture made Leonard feel something he hadn't felt in years. Seen? What's your name? Barron asked. Leonard swallowed hard. His name hadn't mattered in so long that saying it felt foreign. Leonard, he said quietly. I'm Barron, the boy replied, crouching down to meet Leonard's eyes. His voice was steady, and there was no trace of judgment. He wasn't looking down on Leonard. He was simply trying to understand. How long have you been out here? Barron asked. Leonard's throat tightened. He wasn't sure why he felt like answering, but something about Barron made it easier to speak. Almost a year, he admitted. Lost my job when the plant shut down. Health problems, couldn't keep up with rent. And now here I am. He looked away, ashamed of how his story sounded out loud. It's been downhill ever since. Barron nodded, taking it all in. There was no pity in his expression, just quiet compassion. What about family? He asked softly. Leonard flinched at the question. Family. The word felt like a ghost. Don't have much of that anymore, he said bitterly. Parents passed years ago. My brother and I, we don't talk. There's nothing left. He forced a hollow laugh. Not much to lose when you've already lost it all. Barron didn't look away, didn't flinch. He just reached into his pocket. Leonard expected $1 or some loose change, something small, something easy. But when Barron's hand emerged, Leonard's breath caught. It was a crisp $100 bill. Leonard stared, his mind racing. It didn't feel real. The noise of the city, the honking horns, distant chatter, and the rhythmic clatter of footsteps faded into a muffled hum. All he could focus on was the bill in his hand and the teenage boy standing in front of him, who had just changed his world in a way Leonard couldn't yet comprehend. Are you serious? Leonard finally croaked, his voice hoarse with disbelief. He glanced up at the boy, his vision blurring with the sting of unshed tears. Barron Trump, calm and composed, gave a small shrug. Because I can, he said simply, his tone carrying a weight far beyond his years. Barron crouched slightly, bringing himself to Leonard's level. But there's a catch, Barron said, his voice softer now, as though the words were meant for Leonard alone. I need you to promise me something. Leonard blinked, gripping the bill so tightly he worried he might crumple it. Promise you what? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron's expression was steady, almost stern, yet laced with something warm. That you'll use this as a start, not an end. If I'm helping you today, you've got to help yourself tomorrow. Deal? The words hit harder than Leonard expected. No one had framed kindness as a challenge before. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he nodded, unsure if his voice would hold. Barron stood, pulling a notepad from his pocket, ignoring the murmurs of the growing crowd. He scribbled something and handed the torn page to Leonard. Go to this address tomorrow. They'll help you. Tell them I sent you. Leonard unfolded the note, reading the address of a shelter he'd always been too ashamed to visit. Doubt crept in as he gripped the paper tightly. I don't know if I can do this, he admitted. You can, Barron said, his voice steady and calm. Everyone falls, but staying down? That's the real failure. The words settled deep, igniting a flicker of something Leonard hadn't felt in years, hope. As Barron turned to leave, he glanced back, his voice firm. You're stronger than you think. And then he was gone, blending into the bustling streets. Leonard sat there, clutching the bill and the note, feeling the weight of his life shift. For the first time in years, he believed change might be possible. The next morning, Leonard stood outside the modest brick building, double-checking the note in his pocket. The sign above the door read Hope Outreach Resource Center. He hesitated but eventually stepped inside. Warmth enveloped him immediately, a contrast so stark to the biting chill outside that it almost felt like stepping into another world. A woman at the reception desk glanced up from her computer, her expression softening as her eyes met Leonard's. Her kindness wasn't loud or overbearing. It was subtle and unassuming, but it made Leonard's chest tighten. Can I help you? She asked, her voice calm and inviting. Leonard hesitated, pulling the crumpled note from his pocket and sliding it across the counter. "Uh, Barron sent me. Said I should come here." Her eyes flicked to the note, and an understanding smile spread across her face. "You're Leonard," she said, her tone gentle but assured. "We've been expecting you." Leonard blinked. They were expecting him? Before he could respond, she stood and gestured for him to follow. "Come on, let's get you started." He hesitated again, his feet feeling rooted to the floor. The note in his hand felt like a lifeline and a weight all at once. This wasn't just walking into a building. It was walking into a chance at something better, and Leonard wasn't sure if he was ready. But something in her voice, a quiet confidence that this was the right step, urged him forward. The hallway they walked down was plain and utilitarian, but to Leonard, it felt like a labyrinth. His thoughts swirled as they passed closed doors and muted voices. What if I fail again? What if this is just another dead end? The receptionist led him to a small, warm office where a man named Carlos greeted him. With his soft voice and patient demeanor, Carlos felt more like a friend than a caseworker. Leonard found himself recounting his story, haltingly at first, then pouring it all out. The factory closing, the eviction, the shame, the nights spent on frozen pavement. Carlos listened without judgment, only nodding as he jotted notes and asked gentle questions. For the first time in years, Leonard felt truly seen. By the end of their conversation, Carlos had mapped out a plan. Leonard would have a temporary bed in the shelter, a medical appointment for his lingering health issues, and a spot in a job training program designed to help people like him rebuild. Meanwhile, a bystander's video of his interaction with Barron had gone viral. Millions of people were struck by the young man's genuine compassion and the humanity of the moment. Donations began pouring into the center, far beyond what they had ever expected. Volunteers signed up in droves. Inspired to do more than just watch, they wanted to act. One evening, as Leonard sat in the shelter's common room, reviewing job training sessions, a man hesitated in the doorway. "Leonard?" he asked cautiously. Leonard glanced up, his heart skipping a beat. "Paul." It was his brother, the one he hadn't seen in over a decade. They stared at each other, years of estrangement evident but quickly fading as Paul stepped closer. "I saw the video," Paul said. "I didn't know it had gotten this bad." Leonard nodded, his voice low. "I didn't make it easy for anyone to find me." Paul sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm here now. Let's figure this out together." The weight of their estrangement hung heavily between them. But in that moment, Leonard felt something shift. The knot of loneliness he'd carried for so long began to loosen. As the days turned to weeks, Leonard started to see his life take shape again. He wasn't just surviving, he was rebuilding. The kindness of strangers, the support of the shelter, and the unexpected reconnection with his brother gave him a foundation he never thought he'd have again. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, Leonard walked it with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. Barron's words stayed with him. "You're stronger than you think." For the first time, Leonard believed them.